there's no actual change from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie when it comes to Barbieland. Yes, Barbie becomes a human, leaves Barbieland. Ken has a new hoodie. I don't know.
Barbie gets mortality. Ken gets a hoodie. Amazing.
And that is Kenna.
That's so good. That, again, not faulting that. That is literally the film. Iconic. Hi, and welcome to the Gifted Child Symposium, the podcast in which we discuss art at the forefront of progress, at the cutting edge of the capital M movement. In this episode, we will be dissecting Greta Gerwig's Barbie using actual feminist theory so that we are not accused of misogyny.
Trying desperately not to be cancelled.
Yes.
We're doing this for the girlies, guys, not against the girlies. We're doing it for you.
Please. Yes, okay, Barbie.
So for those of you who were living under a rock last year, Barbie is a 2023 film directed by Greta Gerwig based on the toy by Mattel. It's the first live-action film adaptation of this toy, although there's been loads of animated movies and TV series made previously. And yeah, the film was a huge success. It made over $1 billion at the box office. It got loads of nominations and awards for both the cast and the crew. We'll be discussing more of that later. And yeah, it proved to studios that the pink dollar is still very much valuable. It also created loads of discourse, outrage from all sides of the political spectrum. I feel like it managed to piss off both liberals and conservatives at the same time. Truly an achievement. Thank you so much, Greta Gerwig. And we've also have spent the last year, or however long it's been, like 8 months, just staying up late thinking about this, being haunted by it, if you will.
Yes.
And the other thing to mention, context more than anything, is Barbenheimer, because this film was released on the exact same date that Christopher Nolan's biopic Oppenheimer, about the Manhattan Project. They were released the same day, and the juxtaposition between the two films' tones basically created this like rivalry between the two, and it felt very feminism versus men.
Yeah, like obviously it was a marketing scheme.
Yeah.
And loads of people did both, and it was a great way to get people to buy 2 cinema tickets. But then when you were talking about it with other people during that summer, it felt very much like the two genders. Like they gave us 2 options, and it was Barbie or Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
Which relates heavily to what we're going to talk about. But like we were definitely Barbie. We didn't watch Oppenheimer. We went to the theater trying to dress up because everyone was wearing pink and the marketing was amazing, and we had a good time. Like we found it really funny. We were really hyped about it. Like I think everyone was, because the marketing really it really succeeded, and we were really, really hyped for it. I just think because we were so hyped, and because it had pissed off so many conservatives and so many people, and there was so much discourse about it already, and there was so much discourse about the casting and how diverse it was and how feminist it was, that we kind of left Barbie feeling like it hadn't achieved all of those very, very high, almost impossible expectations. And specifically, so this is kind of like just like a little disclaimer that we are gonna be criticizing Barbie with love, and we are gonna be criticizing it with kind of in reference to what it was meant to be, not out of like misogyny, we hope, out of, if anything, our own kind of versions of the world and understanding of feminism, because to us it felt, I think we can both kind of agree that there was kind of like a disconnect with what we enjoyed about Barbie, which was like the humor and the production design and like having a good time on a Saturday night, versus what people really like, people who seem to love Barbie like resonated with, which is this kind of like the America Ferrera monologue, the mother-daughter plot line. Because to us it felt like the plot and these kind of emotional moments didn't add up. And then there's so much
Yeah.
more that we have now explored that doesn't add up. And we just want to investigate why these don't add up, and yet why they seem to be so successful at creating all sorts of emotions and all sorts of feminist discourse.
I think for me the main disconnect was between what the movie actually was and how Greta Gerwig was talking about it before it was released. You know, dropping in all of these like really highbrow comps, like, you know, she talked about being influenced by Paradise Lost, and, you know, also like Greta Gerwig's like previous filmography like definitely lends itself to like, this is gonna be really highbrow, this is gonna be really cinematic.
The
and
teaser
really...
trailer of it being a 2001 Space Odyssey homage.
Yeah, it was gonna be like linked to so much more than just the toy. It was like really like situated within the world. And so therefore I thought it was gonna be this like really poignant coming of age movie a la Lady Bird or something. But obviously, my mistake as well, it is a Mattel toy.
Yes.
Like, this is not Greta Gerwig's fault. This is not anyone's fault, but like, high-key mine. But yeah, that is just kind of where the disappointment came in, because we were expecting this really in-depth discussion about feminism, but and really a multifaceted discussion of feminism, when in reality, it was pretty basic stuff. But yes, as Mijing said, we are going to be criticizing it with love. We're going to be pointing out both its merits, but also pointing out why, like, what particularly we thought could have been filled in more.
Yeah. And also, that is to say that, like, there is a value in the basic stuff, as you just said, and that, like, no matter, like, everything we say about Barbie, it is, as a film, incredibly important. Like, what you said about the pink dollar, and studios actually now realizing that it's not only, like, female audiences, but female creatives can make a lot of money and can make an impact. I think there is just a divide in between maybe Barbie being kind of the start of the movement and feeling in some ways imperfect or incomplete versus how much it could have done or how much it hyped itself up to be. But we are still, like, you know, I feel like, I don't know, especially as female creatives, we owe a lot to this film. So we do want to give it its due, and we want to focus the argument not on this, because this is what we're talking, you know, not on, like, you know, the political spectrum or the how it pissed off Fox News or the white feminism claims that everyone, you know, has done, even though we will talk about this, more on, like, as a piece of art, as a story, which is what we do at this podcast. How is it working as a feminist film? How is it applying or not applying feminist theory? And as, like, you know, a follow-up in a tradition of feminist utopias, how is it built? How is the world it builds? So think about it as, you know, our Encanto episode about Barbie. And, you know, have patience with us. And you know what? Congrats, Greta Gerwig. I know podcasts live forever, so please hire me.
This is not a review of Barbie. This is a discussion around Barbie.
And this is probably our longest intro because we just don't want to get cancelled on our, like, fifth episode or whatever.
Fourth episode, yeah. Or yeah, fifth episode. Yeah. Very long disclaimer. But anyway, let's first talk about how Barbie works and the dynamics Barbie sets up in relation to the patriarchy and feminism in general.
Yes. And Barbieland as well. I think we're going to be discussing a lot about Barbieland because surprisingly the film takes most of the film takes place there, and I think that's the world we're most interested in. Yeah,
exactly. So I think the one thing that we can all agree on, whether or not you were, like, you loved this movie or you were disappointed by it or whatever, Ken was just, like, a really standout character. Again, I'm really trying not to come across as a meninist or something. Ken was just a very fun character, bit, whatever you want to call it. And he really worked as a criticism of toxic masculinity and of patriarchy in general.
While also being a really fun character. And I think that is why it's a good critique, because then we can have fun while also being like, that is fucking annoying or lame.
Exactly. So he fulfilled the role within the movie and also, like, in the sort of thesis of the movie.
Yeah. Good for Ken. Thank you, Ryan Gosling.
Like, I'm sure we don't need to like explain in detail what Ken is. Ken is Barbie's counterpart. He's the male version of Barbie, but in Barbieland is very much not a focal point at all. So it's Barbieland, it's run by Barbies. The Kens kind of exist on the sidelines as not quite their boyfriends or partners or anything like that, but just like they're just there.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like we'll get into this more later. But basically, Ken, like Ryan Gosling Ken, like brackets Ryan Gosling.
Stereotypical Ken.
Ryan Ken, stereotypical
Ryan
Ken.
Ken.
That's how he is referred to in the script.
Is he? Oh, incredible.
Yeah.
Ryan Ken. It's for the rest of this episode. Ryan Ken.
Ryan Ken. He's in the very, very beginning of the film, the narrator says something along the lines of, Barbie has a great day every day. Ken only has a great day when Barbie looks at him. And he is incredibly macho. He's constantly trying to show off. He's constantly nagging Barbie for attention. And he also doesn't have a lot going on upstairs.
He is the perfect, like, man-child, not incel, but like, you know, that vibe of like, I depend on women's attention, but I also don't want it, but I also need it to exist. It's a good it's a good layered critique while also being quite funny as just like a lame man-child.
Yeah, it's a very exaggerated version of like a man-child, because like he's not actually that toxic towards Barbie. He's just not getting the hint.
Yeah.
When Barbie repeatedly is like, no, you can't stay over. No, I'm having a party with my friends. And he gets all sulky because he's like, oh, every night's girls' night. But it's like, well, no one invited you. Like, you didn't have to. So in that sense, Ken worked really well because it resonated with loads of people about like, oh yeah, I've totally met this guy on Tinder. Or like, oh yeah, like, this is such a funny, exaggerated form of something that we can all relate to. Like, for how ridiculous it is realistic.
Yeah. And even the way he fought for Barbie's attention with the other Kens of like, when you just see men doing some fucking bullshit and you're just like, why? Like, even that is like, it's just so funny to witness. Like, we also mention, and we will talk more about this, that there is the actual critique of like, once Ken has power, then he becomes abusive and he becomes like a spokesman for the patriarchy. And that also really worked out of like the literal mind control and oppression of Barbies as soon as he gets a hint that like he can be more powerful than he already is. But let's talk about that. Like, he doesn't have power. Like, he is not powerful at the beginning. He might be a man, but in Barbieland he is kind of like a second-class citizen. So in a weird way, and there is a quote about this, right? The like where Barbie says that the Barbies do basically everything that men do in our world, or the other way around, that Kens are basically women from our world.
So the direct quote from the movie is, Barbie is introducing Sasha to Barbieland, and she says, women hold all major positions of power, control all the money, basically everything men do in your world, women do in ours.
Yes, which is our point, guys. Yes. So yeah, that's basically it. Like, they hold all positions of power, control money, control the government, aka Kens don't. The question has been forever, Greta Gerwig doesn't have to answer, but if we talk about this world, the question forever is, where the fuck are the Kens sleeping? Like, at the beach? Like, I know they're toys, but they are explicitly having dreams and, like, waking up tired. Like, in the case of Barbie, they have houses. The Kens don't seem to own property, nor have a roof over their heads. They have no positions of power. They have no employment, which is really like, it's hilarious that their job is beach, because that's literally how one-dimensional the toys are. But they don't have roles. They don't have like the opportunity to be doctors or presidents the way that Barbies can.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Like, the reason why the Kens don't have houses is because Mattel never made a Ken house.
Yeah, because this is not a toy for men. And the Kens
exactly.
will just live wherever Barbie lives. So like, we understand we're deconstructing a world based on a toy, based on female preference of like the 50s. We understand, but just as a world, hear us out. That in this society, if this was a real society, the organization of Barbieland, basically disenfranchises. This makes Kens disenfranchised, unemployed, with no rights.
Yeah. They are literally second-class citizens.
Yes.
The fact that it's not even that they don't hold position of power, they're literally not allowed to vote.
Yes. Like, they're not even in the room.
Yeah. And it's kind of played off in the way that, like, 60s, like, sexism work, like, you know, like old-timey sexism works, in that, like, because the Kens are so ridiculous and so, like, dim-witted, like, as characters, it, like, to the audience, it's like, well, of course Ken shouldn't vote. He doesn't know what he's voting for. He wouldn't know how to vote. But isn't that literally what they were saying about women before they gave us the vote as well?
Literally. Which gives us to how Kens are both the patriarchy, but also they're himbos.
Yeah.
Especially in the first half. Like, they are literally meant to look pretty. Their job is beach. They are shirtless. They have surfboards but can't surf. Someone answer. And yeah, they're like literally objects as toys, but they're like also objects of like the audience. Obviously we casted Ryan Gosling because he's like conventionally attractive and hot, and he has a six-pack. But also they're like objects for the Barbies. Like, they're just kind of there. And they are like the perfect, up to when they learn about the patriarchy, the Kens are perfect himbos, because they are like never central to the activities of Barbieland. They are kind of desired for their bodies, and they're like a little bit dumb.
Yep.
So just to kind of build this contradictory himbo persona of Ken, I wanted to very quickly talk about the himbos in general, because for whoever doesn't know, I am basically saying himbo as in bimbo and him. Even though bimbo was meant to be for men. Anyway.
Wait, what?
Apparently it was just to refer to someone who was dumb, and it was initially meant to refer to like a dumb man. But very, very, very quickly it became a stereotype. Kind of like it like, we've heard that it's just like the dumb blonde, or like the hot girl with the huge boobs but like no brain. That was what bimbo ended up becoming. And then in the 80s it was coined, the term himbo, reclaimed the bimbo. It was coined in the 80s, and it became popular in the last like 15 years. So it is not derogatory now. And I think that we can say that about Ken in a way. Like, it's not bimbo as in like, oh, you know, dumb women. It's kind of like beloved, slightly dim, more like naive, or like silly in like a street smart situation, or like a book smart situation, but they're actually like kind, good men. And we can see that archetype in like Joey from Friends or Jason from The Good Place. Half of the characters that the Hemsworth brothers plays are himbos. You know, they're like hunks, but they're also very kind.
Yeah. Kind of like the golden retriever boyfriend stereotype.
Yes, but hot.
Yes.
That's it. That's a himbo. And I just started thinking about this kind of like himbo is like basically the flipping of the bimbo in like in a male centered narrative. It's a bimbo. In a female centered narrative, it's a himbo. Because of this amazing interview that came out really recently with Stellan Skarsgård. I'm so sorry, Stellan what?
Skarsgård?
The sweet. He did like a Vanity Fair, like I think after Dune 2, he was just doing like one of those Vanity Fair interviews about like going over his career, and he said that he was very confused when he got offered the role in Mamma Mia, because he doesn't sing, he doesn't dance, so he just didn't understand why he should be on that film. And then he saw that Colin Firth and Pierce Brosnan, the other two kind of leading men, also couldn't do either. So he says, and I quote, "I understood that we were just supposed to be in the film that is in the film that was produced by men and directed by men and men in the leads. You have a bimbo. So we were the bimbos in this female production. We didn't have to be anything but look cute and be silly. There is only one thing that was asked of us, and that was have fun." So yeah, it's a great quote and take and realization from a man of like, yeah, sometimes you just have to be not the lead, sometimes you just have to look pretty. And I think that is why the bimbo is a very effective stereotype to have in Barbie and to have Ken be. There's this great video essay by the YouTube channel The Take that explains how the himbo trope provides, and I quote, model for improvement for those who practice toxic masculinity and offers hope for everyone who deals with it, end quote. So this essay kind of describes how the himbo is kind of like the antidote, at least in the media, to more negative male stereotypes like the ones we were talking about, like the man-child or the nice guy who ends up being abusive, or the kind of brute meathead, because in this case he's not, like the himbo might be strong and attractive, but he doesn't use that strength against the vulnerable. And because he's objectified himself, because he's, again, attractive, he understands a lot of the realities of womanhood, at least when it comes to that. And better than most men or male characters, because he kind of knows what it is like to only be taken seriously by his body, or only be appreciated by like how he looks. And at the same time, his like dimness and like head empty energy allows the female characters to shine. Like he basically, by being a bit dumb and by understanding that this is not his place, he allows the female characters to have some space, which I think is basically what happens in Barbie. We can just make jokes about his job is just beach and every girl's a girl's night, and then just focus on Barbie's narrative. So there is definitely like an argument to be made about the power of this, of like showing men through like a silly stereotype, very harmless, kind of like a window into women's experiences in the world, and within it to show men, like within this stereotype, showing that these men can empathize with women and also make them feel safe. So it creates kind of this dual empathy within the audience and within the male characters in the film.
I think this is also like a good place to bring up like the female remakes of like old movies, like Men in Black 4 with Chris Hemsworth, I want to say, and the new
He is such a himbo.
Ghostbusters with also Chris Hemsworth, I want to say. Is it him as well?
Yes. Thank you so much, Chris Hemsworth.
And like, I mean, like, even fucking Thor in like the later Marvel movies also became a bit of a himbo character. Anyway, Chris Hemsworth, he should have been Ken.
Yes. He should have been Chris Ken. Yes.
Chris Ken.
Yeah, because that is the role of just like in these. We're not saying these are like incredible films either, but like by having a supportive man who knows that he's not the main character, and also just like the comic relief. Like yeah, it's just like a good stereotype to have. And I have heard from friends of mine that like the men in their lives, actually, even the most like conservative or like least literate about feminism, left Barbie being like, so that is how you feel. Which it was a good positive thing of like, yeah, Ken wasn't a terrible villain, and it allowed the men in the audience to kind of be like, oh, but Ken didn't have this and this and that, like it must be hard. So, and also like that, because of that, it gives women like a sense of justice. Like it's temporary, but like, you know, to see men experience gender-based discrimination in the exact same way we do is kind of like, it's fun.
It's comedy gold.
So it's truly not about faulting the himbos. Like they are way more positive and safe archetype for men, and they give women the stage in these stories. And I think this is why a lot of conservatives then felt that Ken was like quote unquote offensive or whatever the fuck, because to them, when you flip the tables, they are like really upset at Ken not having the center stage or Ken not having rights, and they don't manage that second level of empathy that the himbo's trying to build in the audience of like, oh, if you feel this about Ken, then you should feel this about women.
But that is also why Ken in the end doesn't actually represent women, because it's not about the systemic oppression of a specific gender. It's about Ken feeling bad that he's not taken seriously.
Yeah. And specifically by Barbie. It is a good...
Yeah.
In general, we want to say that Barbie is a great interpersonal critique. It's just feels strange to take that interpersonal critique and then make it about feminism or like kind of the patriarchal society we live in. Because then the first half, Ken is a himbo, And even after, when he kind of acknowledges that, like, he just did the patriarchy because he liked horses or whatever, like, we are just kind of relying on him being, like, a himbo. And that works. We discuss, like, himbos are genuinely, like, a fun, positive thing that the media has created. And that has led to better, less toxic male representation. But then, when Ken in the second half becomes the antagonist, and he kind of, like, accidentally controls the minds of the Barbies by introducing them to the patriarchy, then his oppression has more to do with, like, his sense of self than the actual organization of society in Barbieland.
Like, he is not mind controlling the Barbies or taking over Barbieland because he thinks that the Barbies are incapable of running society. It's because he personally feels disenfranchised, victimized, etc. And he's found this mode of empowerment, and because he's Ken, and because he's a himbo, and because he's a bit dim-witted, as discussed, in the nicest possible way, he's just a golden retriever doing what feels right in the instance. His version of the patriarchy is completely devoid of that sort of insidious, patronizing element that the actual patriarchy does towards women. It's about the aesthetic of this idea of patriarchy rather than the systemic thing itself.
Yeah, oh my god, it's literally the aesthetic of the patriarchy, the fur coats and the Mojo Dojo Casa house. So it is, like, we just want to point out that, like, if Ken had stayed a himbo and maybe gone with Barbie to whatever adventures she had, it wouldn't have been as conflicting story-wise for him to represent women, to represent on, like, not toxic masculinity, and also represent men and toxic masculinity. And also to represent the patriarchy, but then not to, because it is a Mattel film for, 16, like, I don't know, 14 plus. I don't know, because of the audience, and it's, like, quite camp. Then we are discussing the patriarchy in ways of, like, Ken's work as Beach. We're not discussing it as, like, Ken is, doesn't have the ability to, doesn't have financial security. Like, it is very superficial without adding that as a moral judgment. It's just genuinely just, like, small, more interpersonal examples. And Ken somehow has to do both, be the woman and the man in the patriarchy in a one film.
I think it's really interesting that you bring up the idea that if Ken had just stayed the himbo sidekick rather than becoming the antagonist in the second half of the film, because if he had stayed the himbo sidekick character in the film, he still could have had the same arc of I am Kenough, I am, like, fulfilled without Barbie, maybe even to a greater degree than the actual movie did, because, and this I think segues well into, like, what we're going to be talking about next, but the end of the movie sees a return to the status quo in Barbieland. The patriarchy / the Kendom is dismantled, and the Barbies are just back in place. And there's no actual change from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie when it comes to Barbieland. Yes, Barbie becomes a human, leaves Barbieland. Ken has a new hoodie. I don't know.
Barbie gets mortality. Ken gets a hoodie. Amazing.
And that is Kenough.
That's so good. That, again, not faulting that. That is literally the film. Iconic.
But what we have been up many a night thinking about is how strange Barbieland is. And again, reiterating, we know this is based on a toy.
And Encanto was based on one song by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Like we have reason to criticize and obsess.
Like, we understand. It's not supposed to make sense. But Barbieland is a dystopia. It's not a utopia. Or rather, okay, Barbieland is a utopian narrative that, as a lot of utopias do, straddles the line between a utopia and a dystopia.
Yeah, depending on, I think, what side you're on. Because utopias what we want to talk about is that utopias kind of take something from our world that could be different or that isn't working. And I think depending on whether you think that should be different or if it's working, then, you know, like a socialist utopia is a capitalist dystopia. And I think this is why Barbie could be interpreted as a feminist utopia in a way, because it is imagined from the mind of a woman who would like to see a world in which women own the world, in which things are as simple and straightforward as the little stories we made up with our toys where we got to be anything we wanted when we were kids. But then when you consider what that means for men and the Kens who are just kind of sidelined, then we get more of a dystopia.
So just to kick off this second half of the episode, some background on utopias and dystopias for you. So the word utopia itself was coined by Sir Thomas More in Utopia, which was published in 1516. It was written in Latin. And utopia, the word, literally means no place, from Greek. And it describes a fictional society or community that is quote-unquote perfect in terms of its governance, quality of life for inhabitants, etc. It's the perfect society.
Whatever perfect means to the writer.
Exactly. It's very subjective, and obviously if you read Utopia by Sir Thomas More right now, it's still like a hellish landscape for women, because it's 1516 and Sir Thomas More was a man. But Utopia by Sir Thomas More is the first example of, well, within the Western canon anyway, of someone using the creation of a fictional world to philosophize about society and morals. I mean, yes, you have Plato's Republic, but this is much more of like a sort of fictional, what's the word, like adventurous story, let's say, whereas obviously Plato was much more of like a Socratic dialogues sort of vibe. And I think also worth pointing out that within the genre of utopian narratives, it is commonplace for it to be framed in terms of someone discovering this alternative world. As in, like, so in Utopia, for instance, Utopia is like this undiscovered island somewhere in the ocean that, for like reasons, never been, like, genuinely, it's like reasons, has never been discovered, and then some traveler happens upon it, and then for reasons can never find it again, because for the same reasons that no one's found it before.
Yeah, and a lot of the other things we'll mention is also like, it comes from that exploration age, like after the Renaissance all the way to, like, you know, imperialism, in the Victorian era, of like, there is just like lands in the world, like the world is ever expansive, and there is just somewhere a society that is nothing like our own that we could learn from but also be fascinated by.
Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have dystopias, which literally means bad place, which is a word that describes a society that is bad. And as you can imagine, utopias and dystopias blur together very often. And you've probably read loads of utopias and dystopias kind of with those two words used interchangeably, from 1984 and Brave New World to The Hunger Games and Divergent.
And you know, sorry, this just occurred to me, because I think if I just think about like Brave New World and Hunger Games as dystopias, the interesting thing about dystopias is that it's like our world if it went wrong. Our world if somehow the US became the capital. Our world if we introduced this thing and we managed to reproduce a certain way. Utopias, and I think this is why
by
definition Barbie is a utopia, it's a separate world. It's not our world gone wrong. It's like a complete different society. But as we will discuss, because we are only human, even utopias that imagine a world separate from ours obviously is about our world and obviously has our prejudices in it. But yeah, I think Barbie is a feminist utopia in the way that it is about a separate society, and it is about imagining, you know, this no place and this perfect society in terms of feminism and women's rights.
Yeah. And then, as you can imagine, most books were written by men prior to a certain point in history, there then came a lot of feminists, like specifically feminist utopias.
They've always existed, and we will talk about different ones throughout time, but they were instrumental when it came to feminist theorists and writers who just wanted to make an argument for why women needed rights and why society needs women and needs to take them seriously, and why they don't feel like the world represents them. So yes, there is like a long tradition of feminist utopias, and Barbie continues it.
Yes. And yeah, let's just talk about like in what ways is Barbie a utopian narrative. So obviously the first thing is that the film is set between Barbieland and the real world. So there is already this sense of a new world to be discovered, a place that exists on the periphery of like the existing world, but has no contact with our society. Barbieland is its own like nuclear entity in itself. How do I put this? It's completely separate. It's like another planet.
Yeah. It somehow feels like it affects our world in toy creation. But our world doesn't affect it unless we know how to get there.
Yeah. And Barbieland also has another completely different set of customs. Like there is a different sense of what is normal. So to Barbies and to Kens and the inhabitants of Barbieland, it's natural, it's instinctual for all the Barbies to run the government. Whereas the viewer might come in and think, oh, but like why? Like question that a little bit.
Yeah, there's like a whole thing with Barbie entering our world and being like, where is the female Supreme Court? Where is this thing?
Exactly.
Like they do not have contact with our world.
Yeah. And then also there's also this completely, well, okay, not completely separate idea of government, but a very different idea of government. Like, yes, there's a Barbie Supreme Court, but clearly they don't vote in the same way that the existing like US Supreme Court does.
Yes.
It's a much more simplistic process. It's a lot more
It's a toy.
It's for children. But I was also gonna say like there's less bureaucracy. It seems like there's actually nothing fundamentally wrong. With this version of this government, it just works. It's like this theorized idea that like it
just works. Yeah.
Utterly faultless. It just works in this ideal society where everyone treats each other really positively and supportively because all the Barbies support each other. But then you think about the Kens and you're like, oh, maybe this is a dystopia.
Yes.
Kens have no rights. They are literally second-class citizens. Like, they are not allowed to vote. They're not allowed to be in government.
Yeah, they don't have the same employment opportunities.
There is just a set of people who live in this quote-unquote utopia that don't benefit from the utopia. So that implies to me that it's not a utopia. This also applies to, like, all the weird, like, discontinued dolls and also, like, Alan, who's just there. They also don't really seem to have any homes. They don't take places in government. They don't really have a say. It is just Ken who kicks up a fuss in the end. But anyway, they are harmed by this government. So we thought it'd be interesting to compare Barbieland to some more classical examples of utopia or utopia examples from literature. So like, for instance, like Utopia by Thomas More, my guy. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it because it's pretty long-winded and it's not that interesting to this discussion. But it's just this like undiscovered society that More argues is quote unquote perfect. It's a lot of like economic theory. But just in terms of like feminism in Utopia, it probably was pretty woke when it first like was published in 1516, because they do say something along the lines of that that wives are subject to their husbands as much as husbands are subject to their wives. So there is this like idea of marriage that is ostensibly equal, but in Utopia women were still confined to housework. Like they weren't really allowed to have like proper careers, and also they had to confess their sins to their husbands once a month.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like Thomas More tried, and sure, good on you.
This is the original Utopia, and just like Barbie, it's not a utopia for everyone, and it is, conditioned by the preconceptions of its author. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then 150 years after Thomas More, Margaret Cavendish, my babe, my love, published The Blazing World in 1666. Margaret Cavendish was this well-educated, aristocratic woman in the early modern period in England, and she was like really interested in science and philosophy and read a lot and was really well read and published a lot, but she was still a woman, so she therefore had to kind of mediate her writing with a lot of excuses and just be like, oh, but don't take me too seriously, I'm just a woman. But The Blazing World is it's considered one of the first pieces of sci-fi in the English canon, and it's also considered one of the first utopian narratives in general, not just feminist utopias. But a brief summary is basically that a young woman, for reasons, ends up stranded in the Blazing World, which is a world inhabited by animal-human hybrids. And this woman is seen by these inhabitants as a goddess and appointed empress. And this is clearly meant to be something of like a Margaret Cavendish write-in, because the empress is super interested in philosophy and science and kind of prioritizes the advancement of knowledge and science within the society, and also seeks to write basically a new law / a new religion, some new like philosophy and theology to rule this world that would prioritize what she deems is the most important to society. And then I'm not going to get too much into it. There is some discussion about invading England, France, and Ireland, and something else. I can't remember. Oh yeah, it's called like Esphy or something, like England, Scotland, France, and Ireland. And the Empress is like low-key talked into invading it. Then the Empress leaves the Blazing World and returns to its original state, which, as far as I can tell, was ostensibly also perfect. But the reason I wanted to bring up this text in specific is not necessarily because of the utopia aspect of it, because it is admittedly a little underdeveloped, but Margaret Cavendish, in the paratext accompanying this published text, placed a lot of emphasis on the fact that she was the one who created this world. She says, though I have neither power, time, nor occasion to be a great conqueror like Alexander or Caesar, yet rather not be mistress of a world, since fortune and the fates would give me none, I have made one of my own. And this was in this note to readers that was, like I said earlier, just like, I am just a woman, you are also women reading me, because men wouldn't read me. But this is why I wrote it, because I wanted to feel power. And I mean, like, I feel like that is essentially what Barbieland ended up being, this, like, exercise in power for women, for Greta Gerwig, for, like, reclaiming Barbie and frivolities and pink in the name of feminism, in the name of empowerment.
This is Margaret Cavendish's specific view of what she wants to be. And she creates a world to create a scenario where this is the case. Yeah. And I think Barbie is the same, of like, is not bothered by the Kens up to the middle of the film, because it just wants to imagine a world in which women have all the positions of power and are the protagonists, and that is valid and powerful.
Yeah. And I think another interesting example of that sort of exercise in power is Sultana's Dream by Begum Rokeya. This is a feminist utopian story that was written in English, but it's Bengali. It was published in 1905, and it features a matriarchy. Men are secluded, women run everything, and society and technology are really advanced because of women. And it's very like explicit with why men are demoted, essentially, because for instance, they say that the workday is now 2 hours long because men used to waste the whole day smoking. Like, women are just so much more efficient at doing things. They're so much more capable, and there's no crime anymore because it was only men who did crime. And there's very little labor to do now because we are so productive. We've invented things to take care of everything for you. It's very Barbieland, just like Barbies need to run the world because Kens are incapable of it, and look how much better we do it anyway, so why would you complain?
We love.
Yeah.
We absolutely love. Honestly, same. Why 8 hours? And then I think as the last example I wanted to bring up, if you look up like feminist utopias or matriarchies, this is the book that everyone talks about. This is our latest example. It is Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So that was written in 1915. All of these before women got the vote in the US and the UK, which is wild, and why they were so necessary. So the plot follows 3 young men. They're university students, and they go on an expedition because they've heard of this hidden land, again very utopia, that has a society completely made out of women, not run by women, completely made out of them. There's absolutely no men in this society. Mm-hmm. When they discover it, they discover that they also, like, women reproduce asexually, and it's just their experiences. A lot, like, the men have different their points of views change as they explore Herland. Some of them become even more misogynistic and hold on to their ideals. One of them falls in love, gets married, has a child. This society very much puts motherhood at its center, but they all eventually basically get kicked out. One of them tries to sexually assault one of the women. It's a whole thing. But it is very interesting because this society is very, very organized, has no conflict, and there is no oppression or domination. Almost like because they're all equal, they don't, there is no need to oppress someone who is different. What I find really interesting, and what I want to compare it to Barbie very briefly, is that Herland actually engages in gender roles, especially in 1915, when they were so, like, gender roles were used to justify why women shouldn't have power. They explore how gender roles are roles, basically, because in this society, when women have to do everything, the narrator is kind of, and the three men in general, they're very confused, and they just don't believe that there aren't any men in this society, because everything is very organized, because women are everything. They also do like labor, they are farmers, they're builders, and because they are farmers and builders, the women who do these roles end up being stronger. He just kind of points out, Margaret, Charlotte Perkins Gilman points out, Margaret, every woman is Margaret. Name a woman, Margaret Cavendish. She just kind of points out that gender-based divisions that oppress women are based on roles that we play that are arbitrary, and that if women had to or were allowed to be in fulfill the same roles and perform the same tasks as men, they would be just as strong, just as smart, just as capable, maybe even more so. Obviously, the book isn't perfect. The use of eugenics has been widely discussed, and that is really stressful. And honestly, because the whole eugenics thing kind of makes sense with why there isn't oppression, because they can reproduce asexually. They create their own kind of they choose what child they're gonna have, if that makes sense. There's a lot of racist undertones.
Yeah.
So to me, this is I think the most I maybe compared to Utopia, Barbie, and Sultana's Dream, the fact that this is a separatist utopia instead of a domination one, that it envisions a world not what if women run the world, it's what if men weren't in the equation at all. It actually gets to examine gender, while Barbie gets to perpetuate it, if that makes any sense. It uses, it recreates gender norms within Barbieland through pink, but also through, how stereotypically they behave and how they look. And even if they get to be doctors, they're still very much the femininity we understand in our world. Versus, to me, Herland is very interesting because it shows, it envisions femininity as a reaction to masculinity and as something that is not given to women inherently.
Yeah. I think you've hit on the point of why we were a bit disappointed by Barbie, because you look at all these utopian narratives, and all of them, a lot of the time, because they're framed as these new undiscovered worlds, so they're existing in tandem with our world / the real world, much like Barbieland, they're just exercises in imaginations that aren't necessarily an argument for what the world should be like, but rather what it could be like. Whereas I think Barbie's messaging was very much this is what the world should be like, girls run the world, everything's solved.
Yeah.
But in reality, these utopian narratives, no matter, how well-meaning they are, no society or no theorized society is going to be completely perfect, because as you said, they're always going to be influenced by this or that personal opinion and this or that personal experience. And it's also much more productive to think about Barbie through this framework of comparing it to the real world of Barbieland as a reflection of our world. Because what if men couldn't vote? I feel that is ultimately why this movie doesn't really make sense to us in this discussion, because what if men couldn't vote isn't really a utopian ideal, nor is it a particularly feminist ideal.
Yeah, there is some radical feminism that adheres to this, but that is not what Barbie is. And we know that it is transferring very much like, I don't know, capitalist and very stereotypical femininity, because that is what Mattel is. Like, we understand that. But when it comes to the organization of society, when we stop being like, oh, it's a world separate to ours, and we just are like, okay, but if this was our world, we are witnessing the Kens having the oppression not of Western women right now, but of like the writers we're talking about who didn't have rights, who had to write and then tell themselves that they were just silly writers no one should pay attention to, who had no right to vote. This is why it makes sense for us to bring up like utopian literature from centuries ago, because this is what it feels like. This feels like utopian literature from centuries ago, because what Barbie is doing is creating a society where half of its population cannot vote, cannot work, have property, like leadership positions, which is what women faced over 100 years ago in Western society. We know that women still face this depending on a lot of like their different contexts and places of the world. But if we're talking about like, you know, in the US, the Kens like oppression is the oppression of like white women in the 19th and 20th century, is not the oppression of Greta Gerwig right now. At least in the systemic way of Barbieland.
Yeah. I think this is particularly exemplified by the fact that Ruth Handler is portrayed as like the peak of feminism and female empowerment and liberation. She just happened to be a businesswoman in her 60s who committed tax fraud. And that's like girl power. That's like we made it, guys. But it's like, okay, sure. But it was very much like an asterisk, but she's a woman the whole time. That's the thing with Barbie. Like, I think that is why Greta Gerwig and Mattel now are trying to like reframe it as this like feminist statement, because back in the day it was actually like, you know, the beginning of the movie like showcases how Barbie was the first doll that wasn't a baby doll. It was the first doll where women could project their career aspirations onto rather than project like motherhood onto. But the movie itself hasn't progressed from that point.
Yeah. And it's weird because Barbie goes to the real world and faces the sexism that like Western white cis straight women experience, like to an extent of like being catcalled and like struggling with body image stuff. And then you have Barbieland where men are facing the oppression of women, not today, but 100 years ago. So there is this huge discrepancy. Like Barbie kind of equates those things, right? Like, oh, Barbie is catcalled and then Ken can't vote. And it's just strange. It's just like a strange utopia.
I think the bottom line is Kens don't actually represent the patriarchy in the movie because they're just throwing a temper tantrum. Again, going back to the whole himbo situation. Like, they are just not sophisticated. Like, no offense, but like, that's the point of them. They're not sophisticated enough to actually overthrow a government. Like, they're not actually sophisticated enough or insidious enough to want to take over Barbieland for power reasons. Their revolution is driven by, I don't know, like a vague, like, what's the word? Like a vague...
like discontent between...
Not even. I feel like Ryan Kang just rocked up from the real world and was like, hey guys, I found out about horses. Want to join me? And then everyone was just like, herd mentality, let's fucking go. Because like, they're not sophisticated enough to be like, yeah, we gotta enslave the Barbies. They're just like, yeah, this is fun. This is neat. And I think that's particularly poignant because Kens aren't taking over the Barbies because they want to implement the patriarchy. They're coming at it from a position of weakness because Barbieland is the real patriarchy.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, I'm gonna get canceled.
I know, and it's so weird, and the movie has that even in the real world, right? Like there is that quote where like the dude, Aaron Denkins is the name of the, like, who he works at Mattel and he's like in the little cubicle, and he, like, Barbie enters the office and is like, oh, is there any woman in this room? And he goes, well, I'm a man with no power, does that make me a woman? And that's kind of that's what Barbie is doing, creating men with no power to make them women, to like within their own matriarchy. It's very strange, and again, it builds this power. It kind of builds a world that relies on the domination of men based on the domination of women from a century ago. A man with no power is a woman, but being a woman is good. And it's confusing.
Yeah.
It's so confusing. And we started this episode, we wanted to talk about Barbie very desperately, and the kind of spark came from analyzing it through Audre Lorde's famous essay, The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House. And this is why the title of the episode is this. And I think that is what we have been building towards this whole time, of just being like, Barbie is not a strong enough exercise in imagination to reinvent a world in which gender-based oppression isn't the exact same as the one women face, basically. Yeah. It just flips the script. So in this case, if we analyze Barbie's, like, quote-unquote utopia, it doesn't really reimagine the patriarchy like a lot of the examples we did. It just rebrands it. It uses the same tools as the patriarchy. And that is what Audre Lorde meant in her essay. Audre Lorde, just brief, everyone read her. She was an American writer, poet, and activist who the queen icon described herself as, and I quote, Black lesbian mother warrior poet. And I want that to be my CV. I'm not Black. I want that, or a mother, but I want that to be my CV no matter what. So fucking incredible. Her work is brilliant, and this essay is her most like famous one, and this is kind of like the framework we started analyzing Barbieland from, because we were like, how is it criticizing the patriarchy while building it? That is what her famous essay, The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House, is about. In this essay, she asks, what does it mean when the tools of racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of the same patriarchy? And more importantly, the title of the essay comes from this quote, where, by the way, in this essay, Audre Lorde is just discussing how she has been invited to a feminist conference, kind of as like a last minute invite as a Black speaker. How we are tackling how we're tackling feminism without actually tackling all of the other systemic oppressions around it, and not including different like women at the table. And what does it mean that feminism that is, you know, trying to dismantle oppression then also oppresses Black women in this case. So that is what the essay is about. In this essay, she writes, and I quote, "For the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support." End quote. And I wish I could just put that on top of every frame of Barbie. Because it's fun. Making men as himbos is fun. We are temporarily beating men at their own game. But we are not allowing other voices, with Barbie. If we're just creating the patriarchy 2.0 in pink, we're not creating real change. And
that is also why it also like fails as a utopian narrative, because it's not really a new world. It's just our world from like 60 years ago, but gender bent.
Yeah.
Like, it's not reimagining anything.
Yeah. And if I may say so, the last bit of that quote, this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. I have to say that the idea that criticizing Barbie is misogynistic is only convenient for the people who still think that having a certain group in power is the only way. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It are the only people who feel so comfortable in the master's house, they just want to run it.
Yeah. That they don't actually see the structure as the problem, but rather who's in power as the problem.
Yeah. And they just need the support from the master. They want to be their master themselves.
Exactly. Like, it just excludes those who don't fit in the binary that the master's house creates. Like, I mean, in the case of Barbie, you've got like all of the sideline characters where, like, I mean, I don't even know what to do with them because they're not dealt with in the movie. But like, what does that mean for the real world audience who watches this movie, and the real world, like, you know, like repercussions of like if you were to theoretically implement this quote unquote society, what happens to the queer Kens, the trans Barbies, etc.? Like, what happens to those who don't fit into the master and the slave dynamic?
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that when you make it so Barbieland and Kendom are the only ways, Barbie and Oppenheimer, Barbie and Ken are the only options, you kind of create a debate that inherently has two sides. And I'm not saying there's only two genders. There's only two ways of being. There is white woman and there's white men. And one of them has to be at the top and one of them has to be at the bottom. This is also something I wanted to bring up when we talked about, like, Ken finding out about the patriarchy and inevitably bringing it back and making it about horses. And then the Barbies have no immunity. It's almost saying, like, it is only natural that power has to be held by a certain group of people. And when the other group of people find out about power, it is only natural for them to want to grab it. You know what I mean? Like, it's inevitable.
It's very colonially minded in the sense that there's always something to be grabbed.
There's always something to be grabbed. It's also, like, oh, if we give, you know, like, whoever we are enslaving or dominating or conquering, if we give them power, then they will rebel against us. It is very much like that. It is assuming that there always has to be an oppressed oppressor dynamic, and that the only way that women get to be on the top is by them being the oppressors, or by them being on the top, or, like, you know, them having the power. But then it doesn't allow anyone else who isn't part of the equation, who isn't part of the master's house, and it's not imagining anything new. It simplifies feminism in that way, not only by making it white, but making it literally a 1+1 equation where you just shift the two pieces, that there always has to be a powerful sector of society. And it also doesn't allow for any other conversation, which is exactly what Audre Lorde was saying. Basically, is almost like the Barbie movie generally said that a world free of misogyny is also somehow free of racism and queerphobia too, right? Like, there isn't, like, those structures of power aren't there. Like, somehow flipping the script on gender is the answer to all liberation, which doesn't really make sense. And I think that is why so many people who criticize Barbie are trying to say, we're not saying that white women shouldn't have power. We're saying that that is not the answer to everyone else, and that white women having power the same way that white men have power is not going to make life any better for anyone else. Like, how can we possibly liberate all of us if we oppress our oppressors with the same tools they gave us?
And I think I would love for us, an hour and 20 minutes into recording this episode, to bring up a very main character in this movie, which is Gloria. Gloria is a Mattel employee in the real world. She is a Latina woman, and she owns stereotypical Barbie in the real world. Like, she owns the physical doll, and that's the connection between her and Barbie. So Gloria also gets involved because she works for Mattel. And Mattel is also something we haven't really discussed in this episode, because they are just there. And you'd think that Mattel, being the giant corporation they are, would be a good comp/a good representation for the patriarchy, but they really aren't, because they don't actually affect change in this story, in Barbieland, etc. So Mattel is just this ominous entity. They don't actually oppress anyone. It feels like how much power do they hold? What is going on with them in general? Like, what do they want? Like, why do they get involved when Barbie escapes? Like, what is the actual repercussion for her escaping? It's not made clear. Like, clearly, like, just, sorry, going into how this movie makes no sense. I understand it's based on the toy, but they mention several times that this isn't the first incident where something's escaped Barbieland. They talk about how what's her name, like Stacy or whatever. No, what's her name?
Skippy.
One of them, sure. One of them, like, escapes and ends up in LA at some point. So this is not the first incident. So it's like, there's a lot of backstory here for us to still have no fucking clue what Mattel want, who Mattel are, why they come to Barbieland in the first place. Like, why do they get involved?
Yeah, and it's so weird because they are still such a good example of Master Tools, Master House, where, like, they don't matter within Barbieland, but the criticism is made very clear that within our world, they're just another only male lead corporation, and that is never addressed. And Gloria is the receptionist.
Yeah, and that is never addressed either, because, okay, so we look at Barbie and we're like, okay, Barbie is singing the praises of women in power. They're talking all about how much Barbie can impact the real world and how wonderful it is that Barbie has like this inspirational effect on young women everywhere. And then the arc is Barbie goes to the real world. That is not the case in the real world. She goes back to Barbieland to have it taken over by Ken, and then that's restored to what is the perfect world already. But in the same way that Barbieland isn't actually changed in the end, neither is the real world. Like, Mattel, the entire narrative surrounding Mattel, Gloria, etc., is completely moot. It's a circle. Because if they were actually trying to do something with diversity and commenting on women in power, then something would have happened to Gloria. But no, Mattel don't promote Gloria. She's still a receptionist.
Yeah, she just like hugs her daughter. The only resolution is interpersonal. It's never like within the kind of feminist ideas that Barbie is set to be talking about.
Exactly. And so that's why like Barbie just feels like this empty speech. Like, you know, Gloria is the solution to the patriarchy, the quote-unquote patriarchy. Her speech about the contradictions of being a woman and how hard it is to be a woman in society is what snaps the Barbies out of their mind control, whatever. But ultimately, that is it. It's just a plot device. It's not actually a message in itself that's backed up by anything meaningful or any meaningful suggestions or meaningful commentary. It's just saying, yeah, being a woman is hard. And that's it.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. Like, we're not demeriting the being a woman is hard and all of the women who have felt heard and all of the men who have realized this. Like, that is really important. But within the context of a utopia and within the context of creating a different world that seems to be the answers to our feminist problems or the patriarchy is when it becomes a problem, is when we are, you know, we shake the conversation around feminism, but then that feminism doesn't actually represent the people who are the most vulnerable within our society, is when we like remind women about how hard it is to be women, but then make the Kens, who are the women in this society, just kind of return at the end of the film to having no rights and no voices.
Yeah. It's very corporate D&I initiative. It just like kind of points out this problem and there's like a epiphany and then no follow-up.
It points out the problem while perpetuating it.
So we really hope that what we said in this episode doesn't discredit Barbie for the work that it did do and for the comfort it brought people and for the joy it brought people. Because ultimately, yes, Ken was a hilarious character. Ken was a great commentary on toxic masculinity. The general trope of himbo is actually, I think, quite funny and quite productive in a lot of these cases. Also, we don't want to discredit how the popularity of the movie was actually very good for women in film. Like Greta Gerwig cannot be credited enough with how many records she broke.
And just like as an experience of feeling vindicated, having fun, being the protagonist for once, like we want to say that Barbie is a good place for that, and we understand completely why people love it and why people just find comfort in it.
Yeah, but ultimately, we've got Ken, and there's so much attention given to Ken. I mean, Ryan Gosling's nomination, the Oscars, is the least of the attention. I feel like, like Ken was the one character that was given an SNL skit. Like, he is the center of the cultural moment for a lot of people. And his whole thing is how men shouldn't be. But then Barbie and we in general in this discourse don't offer them any ideas or any suggestions on what they should be.
Besides himbos.
Besides himbos.
Besides don't.
Yeah, literally. We're just like, don't. Good luck. Which isn't productive. And ultimately, at the end, when Ken is like, he's fulfilled, he's Ken-off, that ultimately isn't useful enough. That's not Ken-off for actual men to do anything with in the real world.
Yeah, like this is the thing, and I know this is like the backlash of it, that like a movie about women shouldn't be the space to tell men what they should do. Like, they should do their homework, they need to, do better. 1000% agree. But the film actively engages with what men are doing and is putting men as both like as the oppressor and the oppressed, and doesn't give them an answer as to how to do either. So yeah, I think Barbie does, because of the way it handled the Ken character, kind of owe certain direction to Ken's because it just got so involved with them.
Yeah. And in response to Gloria's speech, Barbie says, by giving voice to the cognitive dissonance required to be a woman under the patriarchy, you robbed it of its power. So yeah, Barbie is a great place to point out these contradictions. But it also has a cognitive dissonance between comparing Barbieland to the Kingdom. Barbie implies that just by pointing out the contradictions in womanhood, the quote-unquote patriarchy will be dismantled, but then also completely ignores the hypocrisy of oppressing Kens in the same way.
Yeah, literally. And also, the speech is given by one of the only kind of main characters of color who is meant to represent all women, and specifically kind of stereotypical Barbie's experience instead of her own specific experience. So it is a contradiction within itself. I think just in general, what we wanted to point out is that while Barbie is, you know, a very important film, it is just very difficult to be a utopia without politics.
Utopias are an exercise in imagination. Barbie failed to do that because their imaginary world, their utopia, is just our real world, but 100 years ago and gender bent. Therefore, any commentary on our world via that world is moot. It's a circle. It's regressive because we're already well past that. So all Barbie does is point out what we already know, which isn't actually going to affect any change. The way we're going to affect any change is by envisioning outside of the binaries and outside of the systems we've been trained to believe are the only possibilities and what we're used to being the only possibilities.
Yeah, like that is actually what's gonna dismantle the master's house and allow us also to build a new one. Not just, you know, take the Mojo Dojo Casa house back for our girl nights. What we are well past this is kind of like, envisioning a world in which we are only happy if men look at us, just like Ken's. And I think that is why, in a way, Barbie gave us the recipe for its own criticism. Barbie, with that quote right at the end, when Barbie becomes a human, and that weird, like, life insurance montage. like, right, like, as Billie Eilish's amazing song plays in the background, like, iconic scene. She says, and I never really understood it until now, she says, we mothers stand still so our daughters can look back to see how far they've come. And that quote kind of resonated with this discussion where calling it white feminism is not entirely what it is more like calling it, you know, a utopia based on a society that is not our own right now, that doesn't reflect the concerns of feminism right now. So in a way, Barbie is like our mom. Like, Barbie is this mother of feminism. Barbie is this past movement of feminism that is concerned with literally voting and being able to access medical care and like professions. And that is why to some of us feels slightly outdated and not nuanced. It's not because it isn't true or because this didn't happen, it's because we have come so far.
Barbie isn't mothering, it's grandmothering.
Yes. In a way, Barbie is trying to represent modern feminism while definitely just being a time machine into the feminism that we have, honestly, thankfully, gratefully, and we are indebted to our, you know, past mothers and grandmothers and feminist sisters of feminism waves way back. We are beyond that. And there's so much more for us to see and for us to do, and so many more Barbies that need to be at the center stage. Not to rule Barbieland in pink, but to dismantle it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Gifted Child Symposium. We really hope you found it interesting, thought-provoking, and if nothing else, amusing. Please leave a review on whatever your preferred podcast platform is, as it really helps us out. And if you really enjoyed, please share us with your friends. You can find us on Instagram at giftedcs.pod. We'd love to hear from you.
What initially made me want to watch the movie so badly is hearing that Greta Gerwig had been inspired by Paradise Lost, because as I'm sure you're painfully aware by now, I am an early modern girly and Milton's my babe. But let's compare Barbie to Paradise Lost, shall we? Because Paradise Lost is the Bible. It's Bible fan fiction.
Yeah.
So let's map Barbie characters onto biblical characters, shall we? So is Mattel God? is Ruth Handler God? Because she created Barbie.
Well,
Because Barbie is obviously Eve.
yes. Barbie is Eve, and the fruit of knowledge is cellulite, I think.
The fruit of knowledge is irrepressible thoughts of death.
Yes. And then our actual question was, is Ken Satan? Because he...
Yeah.
Wait, this was your point. Is Ken Satan? Discuss.
No, okay. So, like, the obvious comp, well, I would have thought the obvious comp is Ken being Adam. But in reality, Ken is definitely Satan, because in Paradise Lost specifically, and Milton was criticized the hell out of this, like, when this this epic poem first was published, and, like, has been sort of, like, misconstrued over the years by critics as being, like, sexy Satan fanfiction.
Yeah, where, like, you're meant to be criticizing Satan because he fucking took away the power and, like, you know, the status quo, and he is literally Satan. But he is a lovable bad boy rebel.
Yeah.
And he takes over the narrative. Just like Ken. Like, this is not Satan's story, and this is not Ken's story, but it kind of becomes that halfway through.
Satan is such a fan favorite in Paradise Lost in the same way that Ken is winning Oscars. Or being Oscar nominated. Winning. I mean...
Yeah, which is why then it's like, okay, kind of story-wise Ken is Satan. Then who the fuck is Adam? Alan? Like, just kind of just some dude who...
All of Ken's clothes fit him, but he is a neutered nothing.
Yeah! And he kind of also perpetuates the power already. Like, just like Adam perpetuates the power of, like... Not the power, like, you know, the rules of paradise. Alan is just so happy to be with the girlies.
Yeah. He's just like, isn't it so great we get to tend the Garden of Eden? We're living the dream, domestic bliss.
Yeah.
I'm just so happy to have a garden to sleep in.
And Barbie is so Paradise Lost because of, like, there's no sex, there's no romance, like they were just roommates. And then Ken just takes over and makes it about himself, and it's kind of fun.
Yeah. I mean, like, William Blake, the famous romantic poet, so he was such a Milton fanboy. He created a bunch of copper plates with, like, prints from scenes from Paradise Lost. But he wrote a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in which he says Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. So whether or not Milton intended for Satan to be the main character, he ended up being such a fan favorite. He was such a fleshed out, like, character that people were so, like, found so easy to empathize with.
Which is why when Ken accidentally becomes the best character in Barbie, I was like, wow. And I quote, Gerwig is of Ken's party without knowing it. Oh, how history repeats itself.